What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Hard West 2. Just to knock out the usual stuff right at the beginning here, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other YouTubers, reviewers, and content creators. And while that does include the achievements, it does include more than that as well. If you're not subscribed and you go to my channel, first video you'll see is a video explaining everything. And my Steam profile is public and linked in the description below. Feel free to check it out. But with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about Hard West 2. This is a tactical RPG, or a tactics turn-based game from Ice Code Games that released quite recently on August the 4th. As the name would imply, this is set in the Wild West, or more specifically, a supernatural reimagining of the Wild West, which is the specific setting we've seen in quite a few games this year actually, with another one releasing next month, but with this one of course focusing on tactical turn-based combat. So I'm going to give a little bit of a plot setup. I'm going to avoid spoilers, however the plot is more or less pretty cut and dry. We begin the game by attempting a train robbery that then goes south and sees us on a ghost train. Our souls are stolen and we spend the rest of the game trying to chase this train down and get our souls back. And when we jump into the game, we have a few different difficulty options: easy, hard, and nightmare. These are mostly what you would expect. Easy gives you more health, enemies do less damage. And then on Nightmare, it's actually harder to hit the enemies due to a more complex chance to hit system, which is basically just pure line of sight on the lower difficulties. But the main thing to keep in mind with this is on Nightmare mode, there is actually a round limit to combat. In fact, a lot of the achievements for this game revolve around completing certain fights in a certain number of rounds. Well, on Nightmare difficulty, that's not a suggestion, it's a requirement. So if you want to attempt Nightmare, I would recommend running through the game normally at least once so you can kind of anticipate when the enemies are coming from where, as currently there are a few pain points in that regard in terms of the balancing, which we'll get into a little bit later. But while we're playing through Hard West 2, we're ultimately going to be playing as 6 different characters. However, our main character in dialogue is known as Jen Carter. He acts as the leader of the gang, if you will. That said, you don't even have to take him on missions with you. You can pick any 4 of the 6 people to take into a mission, as your squad in combat will be 4 people. But each of these characters is unique, has a bit of a backstory, which can unfold across the game itself. Because interestingly enough, while this is a TRPG, there are some tiny elements of choice and consequence integrated into the game. For instance, as the game progresses, you can choose to side with various companions in dialogue. This will add to their loyalty. As their loyalty increases, this will both reveal more of their backstory to you, should you choose to camp out in the overworld and then talk to them. However, this will also open up options in exploration, as there is a gameplay map and you can go to certain locations. And in some instances, companions will be able to help you get something done that might otherwise require items if you have enough loyalty with them. But from there, let's talk a little bit about character progression. This comes down to equipment and cards. Equipment is relatively tame, but there's a pretty clear progression as the game goes on. There's 3 chapters, and as the game progresses, you will get better guns that have slightly different abilities. But for the most part, it's pretty obvious which guns are better in a given situation. They did try to mix this up a little bit, as certain weapons that might seem the same will then have a different ability. For instance, rifles can either just have a basic shoot, or they can have a trick shot ability attached to them. Trick shot allows you to bounce bullets off of various objects in the environment and line up shots that way. You can actually bounce a bullet multiple times even, which is particularly interesting. So in some cases, a rifle might do slightly less damage, but have that trick shot ability attached to it. And this is the kind of interaction we see with all of the weapons, but the equipment ultimately kind of dictates that character's play style. Pretty much any character can wield any weapon, but given their character ability, which we're about to talk about, you might want to lean them more towards certain weapons. But largely speaking, whether you equip a pistol, a rifle, a shotgun, or a melee weapon on a character dictates how they're going to attack and how many action points that's going to take. Before we dive into combat, let's talk about cards real quick. Cards are, I would tell you, the primary progression in my opinion. As you play through the game and complete missions and their optional objectives, you can come across playing cards. Each character can have 5 playing cards in their hand. Each individual card will give a tiny buff, but I would tell you not to pay too much attention to that. Your goal goal here should be to give that character a poker hand of some sort, starting with, like a pair all the way up to things like a royal flush. Eventually, you want to be able to give the 4 characters you are in combat with a royal flush, because in addition to giving individual buffs per card, this will actually also unlock their special character ability, as well as several other perks that just make them passively better on top of their stats. So while the equipment progression is relatively tame, the difference between having just a pair of cards on a character versus having a royal flush is night and day, specifically with the character abilities, as your ability to use the character abilities is usually tied to this card system, because each of your 6 characters has a unique ability that only they can use, which does a various thing, like summon enemies, do a big AoE, shoot through walls, that type of stuff. And not only is the ability to use that tied to this card system, it will actually be upgraded to one of 3 tiers depending on the poker hand that character currently has. So this is not a system you can ignore, and I would almost tell you it's worth tailoring between every single fight that you get into exactly who has what cards if you really want to do your best, so to speak. And while it's more a suggestion on hard and easy, it's basically required on Nightmare. But let's actually talk a little bit about the combat itself. Before we jump into this section, I do want to mention 2 particular moments that the combat really frustrated me. So if you're playing this, you can watch out for it, I suppose. And that comes in the form of a specific fight and a specific enemy type. So there is a point in the game where you're transitioning from chapter 1 to chapter 2, where you will have 2 fights back to back, which doesn't sound that bad, but you have to understand that you do not heal outside of combat just naturally. You have to either go to a town and have your characters healed, or you have to rest with the appropriate provisions item to then heal all of your characters. You don't heal in between combat, so having 2 fights back to back with no warning is a real problem. And that was probably, in terms of combat, the most frustrating part of the game for me, because they don't really give you any warning about it, which means you either have to load back a couple hours worth of saves or struggle through it. And either way, not a great feeling. And it's a huge difficulty spike compared to everything up to that point. And then there is a specific enemy type I wanted to talk about, and that is the Blackhearts. These guys are the worst. I did not like them. If they were used a little more sparingly, it wouldn't be so bad, but you'll fight a lot of these guys, and they're the worst. They don't do a ton of damage, but I would tell you, don't even hit these guys if you cannot completely kill them in one turn. They have a very overpowered ability, where if they've even taken a single point of damage, they have this sort of life drain effect that seems to have no limit on who it can hit or the distance, and it will almost one-shot a character, as it will take the vast majority of their life from full health down to practically nothing, even if the Blackheart is only missing like 1 HP. But they do not use this ability if they have full health. So the way around this is to just kill them from start to finish in one turn. But again, they don't use these guys sparingly. You'll find a lot of them, and they're hands down the worst enemy. But from there, let's talk about the rest of it. The combat itself is a 3 action point system, which, as I've mentioned a few times, is becoming very prevalent in the turn-based world, if you will. You'll have 3 action points, which serve as both your movement and your ability to perform an action. So moving your full movement is essentially 1 action point, and then you can continue to move farther with your extra action points, or you can take a various action, which will usually cost a differing amount of action points depending on what it is. So always pay attention to how many action points what you're doing is actually going to spend. And furthermore, when it comes to your weapons, you might want to pay attention to whether or not that ability has a cooldown of some sort, as there are a few weapons that do exceptional damage, but you can only use them every other turn, which means if you don't have a weapon equipped as a backup, you might cause yourself some unintentional problems. Now, there are a few systems here that I think make the combat very interesting. For starters, there's Bravado. Every time one of your characters kills an enemy, they get all of their action points refunded, and there's no limit on this. You can do it as much as you can kill, basically. Meaning that you can set up these gigantic combos, and this is really how you're going to hit some of those achievements where you have to do it in so many rounds. Because if you're careful and do a lot of planning, you can set up these gigantic turns where you wipe out the enemy in like a turn, basically before they even get a chance to move in a lot of cases. And especially a Nightmare, mastery of this system kind of is the game. Now, you combine that with the trick shot I mentioned earlier, being able to bounce bullets off of various objects, and you have a game that is relatively easy to learn and difficult to master. The combat itself here is really not that deep in terms of turn-based stuff. Everything's pretty straightforward. It's presented to you pretty clearly. It's just how well you manage to use those systems against the enemies that you are facing. And when you manage to do that really successfully and kind of just nail that combat loop and again just kind of wipe out the enemy team before they even get a chance to go, it's a very satisfying feeling. So in a tactics turn-based game where that is relatively important, I do think they nailed that part of it. It is fun to engage with this system. And from there, let's talk about gameplay. So outside of combat, you will be doing a few other things. As I mentioned, there is a game overworld. So across the game's 3 chapters, you will be in a specific area of the world. As chapters progress, you don't get to go back, so make sure you do everything you want to do when the game gives you a warning that the chapter is ending. But in this overworld, you'll either be able to chase down the main story, which are your yellow objectives, or run around the map and explore a little bit. You can get extra loot this way, find extra weapons, extra playing cards, that type of stuff, as well as some unique trinkets. And this is where your companion loyalty comes up quite a bit, like I mentioned earlier, and you can actually set camp out in the overworld, and you can use this to talk to your companions, hear more about their backstory, as well as a chance to rest without actually having to pay for it. Because if you don't have the provisions required to heal your party at camp, you'll have to go to one of the towns, which while it's not a lot, I do think it adds to the game quite a bit, and I enjoyed seeing it there, as it makes you feel a bit more in control of what you're doing outside of just the traditional sort of hub screen that you're operating out of and then jumping straight into the combat itself. It adds a bit of RPG to your TRPG, which I enjoyed. And the fact that it's relatively tame is also, I think, a good idea in general because this is an indie developer, and chances are if it had gotten too ambitious, it wouldn't have been a good idea. The last thing I want to talk about before we hit positives and negatives are a few technical issues I noticed. Now, I do want to say that they are actively working on all of these things. They've already released an update, so with any luck, if you're watching this in the future, these problems have been resolved. But as of the time of this review, they are an issue, so they're being mentioned. So, a couple technical problems. One, this is a Unity game, and it inherits a lot of Unity Engine's problems when it comes to isometric games. For starters, and probably the most noticeable thing for people, is that as the game progresses, the load times get progressively worse. What will start with relatively reasonable load times will then increase as the game goes on to where you're waiting like 1 to 2 minutes per load screen towards the end of the game. And that's me with an M.2 drive for this. And then the other thing is that there were a few crashes and related issues. Now, on the bright side, I didn't really run into any bugs at all, or at least nothing substantial. And then, unfortunately, though, there are the crashes that will happen. And in one case, I crashed the game and then could not load it back, and I actually had to clear the Windows registry, which is a bit more of a complicated problem that I wouldn't expect a lot of people to know how to deal with, and that's not the kind of thing just uninstalling and reinstalling can fix. So if your game crashes and just will not load back up, that might be something to look into. But from there, let's talk positives, negatives, and wrap this thing up. Positives, the combat is fun, albeit a little simple. As far as tactics games go, it's not a very complicated combat system, but I do think there's more than enough there, and there's a really big learning curve to it that it's a really enjoyable experience kind of mastering that system, even if it is simple. Another big positive for me was the sort of supernatural Wild West thing. I think they managed to balance those things really well. You have the things that are typical to a Wild West story, like robbing trains, robbing banks. There's even horse-mounted combat, which is basically regular combat, but the scenery's moving. But nonetheless, it looks and feels really cool in that regard, but at the same time, they have all these supernatural elements in place. Sometimes you're fighting spirits or monsters or just demons straight up. There's a lot of fantastical things to see in many instances. All while you're being told these stories of your individual characters and kind of their life in the rugged West. And in that particular regard, I think they really nailed it. But naturally, there are a few negatives as well. Obviously, the tech-related issues, the load times, the crashes, it's not unplayable by any means, and I want to make that clear. The crashes only happened a couple of times across like 30 hours, so it's not unreasonable, but they are there. Probably more of note there is the load times, though, honestly. And then beyond that, I think the regular kind of normal, or hard as it's called, difficulty option really needs a bit of a balance pass. There are just huge difficulty spikes that come out of nowhere with no warning. I think the Blackheart enemy in particular needs some attention. They tend to just be very overpowered compared to every other enemy. Even enemies that you find in the late game missions do not have half of the killing power that the Blackhearts do. It's ridiculous, and there's so many of them you're going to have to fight. And that's probably the most egregious example, but there are a couple others. I think that mode specifically really could use a bit of a balance pass. That brings us to our conclusion. Overall, I would tell you that Hard West 2 is a very fun game. It's a competency RPG. And for every issue I can mention and point out and that I have here, I can also say that I had a lot of fun playing this game. I found the combat to be satisfying once you finally line up that sort of perfect round. And once you manage to do that, some of the issues with balancing kind of disappear anyway, but that requires a certain level of system mastery. And in spite of those things, I do think it's a great game. I had a lot of fun with it again. So for me, especially for the $30 asking price on Steam, definitely a game I would recommend buying to people, as it had a lot of fun. Even more so if they patch this up quickly and get those issues resolved, which again, they've publicly stated that they're working on, so we'll see if that happens. And if those issues do get resolved, even better, the game's in an even better state, as those few things are really all that's holding this game back, in my opinion, in terms of being just a fantastic indie game. But even in its current state, I would definitely recommend buying it. So there you guys go. There is my review after 100% for Hard West 2. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I truly do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.